So you saw how you can switch a single route to lazy loading and how you can load a component lazily with that load component property. But of course, here in this application, it's not just this route that would benefit from lazy loading. Instead, this task's new route would also benefit from it. And it's quite common that you might have multiple routes that would benefit from being loaded lazily. Now, of course, we could switch this here, but that would actually be a bit harder because this can leave edit page, can deactivate guard, can't easily be outsourced from that file since it needs the new task component type reference. So splitting this into a separate file without eagerly loading the component file will be difficult. But thankfully, it's also not a problem we have to deal with. Because instead of setting up lazy loading on a per route level here, it would make more sense to load the entire group of routes lazily in this application. Which we can also do by going to the main app routes.ts file. And here, Angular actually gives you an alternative to referring to the user routes as we're currently doing it. Because at the moment, I'm importing these user routes from my users.routes file, and therefore, of course, this file gets loaded, and all the code that's loaded in there gets loaded. All is loaded eagerly. To change this, we have to replace this children property here in this route with the load children property. So you can see the pattern here. When the property starts with load, like load component did, here we're talking about lazy loading. Now, however, with the goal of lazily loading multiple routes and therefore multiple components at once. So what we can do here now is again define a function as a value for load children. And this function, just as before, then wants the result of calling the import function. And again, to import, we should pass the path to the file we want to load lazily. So in this case, the path to this users.routes file. I'll copy that and paste that in here. And then just as before, you should call then, and then actually return the result from that imported file, so this routes array. And that's it. With that, it's now just important that you delete this import. Otherwise, even if you're not using it, you're still importing that eagerly. So we should remove that. But with that, we're now loading the user routes and all the things that are imported there lazily. Which is, of course, a way better approach than doing it on a per route level in this case. So if you save this, if you go back to the starting page and you clear your network tab, you'll see that if you click on a user, we're loading even more chunks here because now we're loading all the lazily loaded code for this entire tasks feature and all the related routes. And that's therefore how you want to approach routing-based lazy loading. Identify the routes for which it makes sense to lazy load their components, and then see if you can maybe structure your app such that you can load entire groups of routes lazily. With that, in this application, we could now, by the way, of course, also get rid of this lazy loading here, because we essentially always end up on this route if we navigate to users/some user ID. So lazy loading this actually makes no sense anymore. And therefore here I will indeed go back to the non-lazy loaded approach. So to the eager loading. And I'll also put the resolver here back into the task component file. Simply because here for this app, that makes a bit more sense in my opinion. Hence, we can also remove all the unused imports here. And then go to the tasks component file and re-add and export the resolver here. Now in the users routes.ts file, we just also have to add that import to resolve user tasks. With that, of course, the tasks component is loaded eagerly again in this user routes file, but the overall file, as you just learned, is loaded lazily. And therefore, of course, the tasks component in the end is also loaded lazily. So now that you know how to lazily load routes, there's one last kind of related feature that could also be interesting to you. And that would be lazy loading of services, you could say. Because in this application, I got this tasks service, which is in the end only used by these task-related components. Put in other words, this service and all the code that's imported into this service isn't needed when the application starts. At the moment, however, it would always be loaded right at the start because we're providing this service in the application root injector. And this injector, as the name suggests, is set up when the application is started. So therefore, what you could consider doing here is get rid of this configuration object you're passing to injectable, so that this service will actually not be provided with the root injector anymore. And of course, if you do that and you save this, your application will break if you try to visit a user here, if you try to load the data for the user. But now the trick is to provide the service in a different way. Specifically, you can go to this user routes.ts file now and provide the service there. You could add another route here, which has an empty path and which has a children property, so that you can wrap those routes that already existed with that route. And I'm telling you why I'm doing that in just a second. So with that, I have this extra route here as a wrapper around all these task-related routes. And I'm doing that because you can now go to that route and add the providers property to it. You can add that on a route level as well. And when adding providers to a route, all nested routes and the route to which you added will have access to the providers defined here. So to the services defined here, for example. And therefore now we could add the tasks service here to this providers array, and that would make it available to all the nested routes. But since these routes here, these user routes, are loaded lazily, this service would now also be loaded and set up by Angular lazily. And therefore with that, if you save this, and if you click on a user, you'll not be getting an error anymore, but the tasks service code is now actually also loaded lazily. And that's just another useful tool to have in your tool belt. Because of course you sometimes have services that must be available to the entire application, and in that case you can't lazy load them. But if you have services that are only relevant to a subset of your components and routes, you can absolutely consider lazy loading them by lazy loading them with help of this route providers array. Of course, this alone does not lazy load the service, though instead it does lead to this service being lazy loaded because the overall routes, this overall array here, is loaded lazily with help of this load children property in our app routes. But that's therefore something you could do.